Greetings, and as you can see, we're delving deeper into the worlds of The Road and 1984 in another comparison video, though with an emphasis on the former. For fans of both books, it may seem odd to claim comparisons between them. However, one fundamental and undeniable link between them is in the objective of both main characters, the simple, if profound desire to remain human in the face of overwhelming challenges. In the interests of brevity, I'll assume you have a grounding in 1984, both its plot and setting. If not, I suggest watching or re-watching the first comparison video, or if you're hungry for general lore information, then there's no better place to binge 1984 content. With that said, let's consider the question of who succeeds and who fails to remain human in both of these great works. I focus on the unnamed man in The Road, as he arguably has the deepest challenge in this regard. The man is perhaps more interesting too in this context, given he is a bridging character between the old, civilized world and the new, darker world of the novel. To quickly recap, The Road is a post-apocalyptic novel with the simple premise of an unnamed man and his unnamed son travelling across a post-disaster America using the titular road. An unspecified disaster has blocked the sun, leaving the skies a perpetual grey and ash-filled. Days and nights are cold, food almost non-existent, and civilized society itself has completely collapsed, leaving the few survivors to battle not only the ever-present threat of starvation and disease, but other survivors who have fallen to cannibalism, murder, and every other vice. In this worst of worlds then, remaining human is to reject the very real temptation to simply kill and consume your fellow man. Though scavenging where they can, the man and his son generally try to avoid killing people without cause, and resolve to starve rather than to eat fellow human beings. As you might imagine, however, being a good guy, as the pair call it, and carrying the fire is easier said than done for the man. In a different if similar way, Winston Smith, the protagonist of Orwell's novel, also faces his own challenges of staying human. As an outer party member and secret thought criminal, Winston is under constant threat of exposure, arrest, torture, and ultimate execution. Given the power and efficacy of the state and thought police, Winston feels certain he will be caught, but throughout most of the novel, hopes he can at least remain human. But what does this even mean? For him, mere survival is not enough. He secretly envies the proles for their relationships and loyalties, and develops feelings for Julia. It's clear that his feelings and love for Julia are the important things just prior to his arrest. To fully give yourself to the party in his world is to feel nothing other than hatred of thought criminals and other enemies. The only laughter is laughter at a defeated enemy. The only love, that of Big Brother. Considering the two characters together, it may be easy to assume the man has the harder time, given it's likely he'll have to do some morally questionable things that he would never have done before the disaster to protect himself and, more importantly, his son. Danger and painful death are far more imminent threats in the man's world, it's true, but one thing we can say is that Winston is somewhat handicapped from the very beginning. Winston may find it difficult to carry the fire, to borrow the phrase, as he was never properly taught to. In a similar, if less extreme manner to the man and boy, Winston's childhood was plagued with chronic hunger too, rummaging through trash and constantly begging for food. This instilled in him a survival mentality that overrode his feelings of care for his mother and sister. We see this in action with his theft of the chocolate, something that he deeply regrets later in his life. Given his sister was sick and starving at the time too, it's no wonder Winston subconsciously perceives the event as killing both his sister and mother. Given his harsh childhood, and then his immediate effective adoption by the state and indoctrination into the party, we can see how he never got the chance to really love or feel ordinary moral feelings. We see this in many places in the book, and for more on this, I suggest that you watch the earlier dedicated video on Winston's loss of humanity. Today I would briefly cite the diary entry at the very beginning of the book, in which he recalls the reaction of the party members, including himself presumably, to the blowing to bits of the refugees in the war movie. Unlike the prole woman who kicked up a fuss and was thrown out, Winston and his colleagues applauded the act. Indeed, we know there's a desensitization generally to violence and immorality in the party. Children are commonly taken to public executions. Syme gleefully details these too, and joyfully recounts raids on enemy villages and the tortures in the cellars of the Ministry of Love. Proles, as Winston says, are still human. They can feel disgust at these things and retain a love for each other that has mostly been ripped out of all party members, and even from thought criminals like Winston. Winston feels he has to relearn how to feel, how to be human. In contrast, the man of the road does feel. Indeed, the poor man lives in constant, desperate terror for himself and his son. Unlike Winston too, he comes from our world more or less, though the year of the setting is not specified. The man seems to be a typical, if perhaps somewhat intelligent and determined guy from the late 20th century. He's perfectly normal in having had the luxury of feeling, in living in a normal civilized society where rules and morals are enforced. Interestingly and ironically, this is not so with the boy, the other main character of the book. The man's son was born after the disaster and has never experienced the pre-horror life. Whilst certainly afforded this moral compass through the protection of his father, it's ironic then how the son appears more moral, more altruistic certainly, than his father. It's apparent that the boy is somewhat shielded from interactions outside of his father and mother. An encounter with a bad guy reveals that this was the first person, other than his son, that the man had talked to in over a year. The man also explains that the encountered man in his group were the bad guys, suggesting they had been lucky up to that point in not encountering such men up close. The boy's attitude towards people is generally positive, even after some dicey encounters, but it seems this is as much down to blunt curiosity and naivety than any considered moral position to act the way he does on a basis of previous experience with people. The man has no such luxury and necessarily presents as the practical, even cold contrast to his young son. On a broader level, a spoiler perhaps you'll be glad to know, both the man and his son never eat their fellow men, despite the chance to do so, an event I'll not elaborate on, though it's one of the more disturbing parts of the book. Yet not being a cannibal is hardly a high bar for retaining one's humanity, perhaps even in the man's screwed up world. To be honest, I find the man's journey heart-wrenching, and the decisions he makes made in extreme circumstances, fueled by his fierce devotion to protecting his son. Yet even so, we can argue that he is a somewhat grey character like Winston in his own world. One clear-cut example for me where the man had little to worry about was his shooting of the cannibal earlier in the book. For context, the man and boy had been awoken by a group closing in and had to run for it, only to be spotted by a cannibal from the group. After a brief, tense exchange, the man does attempt to lead the cannibal away, and promised even to let him go later on. However, the cannibal lunges at his son, and the man has no choice but to shoot him dead. The shot, of course, is heard by the other cannibals, and the man and his son barely escape capture. The boy is terrified into temporary muteness, but later questions if they are still the good guys, to which his father firmly answers that they were. In this case, there was little more he could have done, other than to unnaturally surrender himself and his son to certain painful death through being consumed limb by limb. The choice then was clear. Two later cases where his choices are more open to question are when they meet Eli and later on the unnamed thief. Of course, as we shall see, the man is hostile to any encounters, to which I say, can you really blame him? Similarly, Winston likely thinks in similar terms, and could perhaps sympathise, given he too has to watch who he chooses to interact with, given denunciations are common. Face crime is a particular hazard, even when just talking to so-called friends. We see Winston turn his face away from Syme's scrutiny while talking to him, and how he had to check his own words in saying except for the proles, when Syme observed that no one would understand the old-speak conversation that they were having, in a few decades' time. The man's paranoia in the road is next level compared to Winston's caution. Simply revealing oneself in the man's world can spell death. In the encounter with Eli, an old man travelling the road, Eli himself explains how he doesn't use his real name, as he can't trust the man or others not to use it, that is, to reveal information about him. The conversation is quasi-hostile, with the man worried Eli is a decoy or lure for an ambush. The boy seems glad to meet the old man and correctly observes that he is simply scared. Eli says he has encountered others, and saying that he's 90 years old doesn't stop them from hurting him. The initial fear seems genuine then. The man maintains throughout the interaction that he would have given Eli none of their finite food, that it was the boy that gave him food and persuaded him to allow Eli to eat with them and remain by the fire. The man does engage Eli in conversation and does soften a little in attitude, though in terms of old notions of kindness or charity, the man doesn't quite make it. I suppose ultimately he does demonstrate an indirect charity, in that it's his ultimate decision to help Eli. Perhaps, given he had refused to help people beforehand, he didn't feel comfortable denying the boy's pleas yet again. A later encounter, closer to the cannibal encounter in context, and certainly life-threatening in a different way, is arguably the greyest situation in the novel. The context is that an unnamed thief had taken all of the man and boy's things. This all but dooms both to death, given it was all of their food, blankets, everything. Weak and angry, and certainly terrified out of his wits, the man does catch up with the thief, whom he recognises as an exile from a commune. Armed with a pistol, he forces the knife-wielding thief to hand over not only the cart that they use to keep their supplies in, but also that he strip off his own shoes and clothes. The thief begs him not to force him, as this, more certainly than even stealing their supplies, will kill the man through exposure given the cold. The boy pleads with his father, arguing the thief was simply scared. I'd add that he was similarly starving and desperate too. This is actually not an easy one to answer. For us, in our comfortable, well-fed reality, perhaps it's easy to judge. In this world, food is like gold dust. This may have been the thief's only chance to live. Is it then immoral to try and save yourself? I would argue that the urge for self-preservation is instinctual, animalistic, and very hard to overcome. Perhaps the boy inherently understands this, hence his upset reaction to the whole situation. Unfortunately, the man only sees red, and what could have happened had they not caught him. Having stripped the man of literally everything, the thief is left to his fate as they move on. So, is this the point where the man fails? Has he lost his humanity? Is he no longer a good guy? Technically, the act itself was not just, though it could be argued that the thief knew his act would all but condemn the man and boy to death. Yet he didn't. Did he then deserve death for the attempt? Well, I don't know. It's hard to riddle out things if you're not the man, and in the very moment. To his credit, the man does relent soon after. He does go back with the boy and try to give the thief back his clothes. Alas, the thief has already gone, perhaps resigning himself to his fate. I imagine sometimes that he waded into the sea to let the cold take him quickly and away from possible butcher by cannibals. The man does leave the thief's confiscated clothes and even some food, but what is done is done. Personally, I don't like to be too harsh in such situations. Hindsight, they say, is 20/20, and perhaps moral clarity is crystal clear too when removed from such an extreme setting. Overall, I think the man didn't lose his core of humanity. While his life on the road certainly must have hardened him and did cause him to kill, he was still, at heart, carrying the fire. The man cannot be called a murderer, aside perhaps arguably with a thief. He shot the cannibal in self-defense. He scavenged all he could find, but never clearly stole from a fellow survivor. An interesting question is, would he have done what the thief did if the roles were reversed, especially with the ever-present incentive of his starving son at his side? On this, I think he might have done. Does this muddy the moral waters a little more? Certainly so. In one sense, the man does do something similar, though it's a stretch. He and the boy find a fully stocked bunker, and though reasonable to assume its owner is dead, given the severity of things, he couldn't know this for certain. So there was certainly a risk here that he and the boy were similarly taking someone else's survival stash, the bunker stocked with food, even if this was unlikely. The man, however, suffers no hesitation about using it, unlike his son, who even suggests a quasi-prayer of sorts to the people that left the stash there. Though the greyer part of the man's journey, however, I think that the thief incident is still pushing it a bit. Under immense existential pressure, and with a burning desire to safeguard his starving son, I would personally defy anyone not to make similar choices as the man. Were his actions in punishing the thief harsh? Yes. Immoral? Probably. Does that translate to him losing his humanity though? No. Interestingly, however, even though the man's world is much darker than Winston's, it seems he largely succeeds in remaining human, or in carrying the fire, whereas poor old Winston probably didn't have much of a chance to begin with. In the novel, it's clear Winston certainly desires to emulate the proles, the loyalty and love they feel in their relationships. He even values his love for Julia to the point of Room 101, yet it's also apparent to me at least that Winston's own humanity has been almost irreparably damaged even before the novel begins. Despite his inner admiration for them, it's clear Winston both admires and, in line with party orthodoxy, hates the proles somewhat, dismissing them as mindless and mere vessels for rebellion when he does think of them positively. We see his damaged moral spirit too in small ways, such as his callous kicking away of the severed human hand during the rocket bomb attack, his casual description of the war movie, and his own dismissal of the prole woman's reaction to it. Perhaps most damning of all, we have Winston's mock initiation into the Brotherhood with O'Brien. Here he assents to all O'Brien asks of him, including murder, sabotage that would kill hundreds, and perhaps most shocking among other things, that he would willingly throw sulfuric acid into an innocent child's face if that was somehow required. It's important to note too that as far as Winston was concerned, all of this was genuine and he was deadly serious in his intentions. Why? Well, we know Winston harbours other emotions other than love, particularly for Julia, and disgust of the proles. He also has a strong hatred of the party, later focused on the person of Big Brother himself. Indeed, this is the final obstacle to his fully coming over to the party. Obedience is not enough. You must love Big Brother. Indeed, in the meeting with O'Brien, we even see Winston hesitate when Julia reacts to the potential of their splitting. He certainly thinks about this before agreeing with her. This shows then that Winston's hatred of the party certainly rivals his love for Julia. Ironically, his hatred for the party in BB was facilitated by his conditioning to the extent that though he wanted to relearn more human emotions and attitudes like the proles, he freely admits that he, Julia, and the party are not human beings. They were made this way and maintained as such by the party. Despite the stark harshness of the road then, the man seems more capable of retaining his humanity than Winston. Unlike the man, Winston never even shoots anyone or overtly causes the death of anyone, yet he is far less human despite this. At least in the man's case, despite the difficulties, there is still a chance of carrying the fire in his own world, whereas in Oceania, to act morally, to refuse to partake in the party's immoral actions and attitudes, is practically impossible unless a party member is suicidal. So what do you all think? Is it possible to carry the fire in 1984? Do you agree that despite the arguably worse circumstances in the road, that it's still possible to remain good in that world, whereas in Oceania, this is all but impossible for a party member? Tell us all your answer in the comments section, and remember, the proles are human beings, said Winston aloud. We are not human.